Good evening. Well, I guess in some parts of the world it's good evening. I hope you're all keeping well and everyone's okay. Let me get a sip of coffee. You know the way I've been to talk about this for a while, but it just dawned on me this morning. I'm coming out. I'm getting my coffee, and I'm coming out of the garage, and you walk by the magazine stands that you get in all over the world in convenience stores and garages in Ireland. Garages in Ireland are very well developed. You know, they cook food and everything. We have a actually some garages will cook some garages, as America call them, service stations in Ireland. Lots of them will cook food that's as good as any restaurant. They have sit down tables and everything. That's a big deal in Ireland, tremendous value. But there's one in Ballina that cooks meals that are just out of this world, and they're cheap. They're cheaper than fast food, and you get served on a proper plate with cutlery and everything. But anyway, I digress. Outside the wonderful world of Irish service stations and their phenomenal deli and food counters that are unequaled anywhere is the magazine stands that you get all over the world at near the checkouts or on the way out the door. And I'm standing there and I'm walking out and I'm looking at Empire magazine. You know, the movie review magazine, Empire? I think it's published in the UK. And it has a thing for the new Doctor Strange film on the cover. Now that's those two issues have been there for the last month. No one has bought them. And it's the same with the newspapers that are in your local supermarket. Nobody buys them. One or two old people might buy them. Or, but no one else buys them. But that's not their purpose. If they were to stand alone on their own merit, they went out of business years ago. That they're advertising stands, and they're paid for by the governments. Sorry, went down the wrong way. Or in the case of like Doctor Strange on the cover of Empire magazine or whatever, they're paid for by the movie company, the distributors. So you're not looking at a business, you're looking at a promotion, an advertisement, a billboard in the form of a magazine. So when you're walking through your supermarket and you see all the tabloids and all the main, and they all have headlines, the reason why they're all the same headline is the governments have paid them to write the same headline. So, that was the purpose of that. Like the NGOs will pay the newspapers. They're advertorials, they're advertisements. See, there's why there's no journalism really anymore, except in the alt media. Now, one of the magazines I saw, it was a current affairs magazine. I don't know if it's The Economist or something like that. One of those rags, and it had Russia eyes Africa, and a picture of like a Russian bear looking at Africa like it's about to devour it. Pure propaganda. Now, this is an unspoken thing in the world that is really changing things and may play into the open borders thing in the West as well. Russia and China have no baggage in Africa. They never had any colonies there. They never exploit. They never sent children down into mines to get cobalt and lithium for Greta. They don't have that history. They don't have that history there. So therefore, they're seen in a very different light than the Europeans and the Americans and the Westerns in general. There's no baggage there. Now, you'll be amazed to find out, but it's absolutely true, is that China and Russia have been developing Africa in a way that Europeans haven't. And what's the Europeans? The West, the Western globalists. You know all those things like Live Aid and, the Trocare boxes here in Ireland and all the money, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and all the African charities money and all that stuff. The purpose of that was to keep those countries useless, was to keep those African nations useless. So as long as they were useless, they would never take control of their own resources and Western governments and Western globalist interests, same thing, corporations, could go down and exploit Africa to the heart's content, whether it's uranium from Niger to power the French nuclear power plants, lithium and cobalt in Congo for Greta Thunberg, or diamonds for the Hasidic Jews in Belgium and Antwerp, down in South Africa. They've always kept Africa in the dark. I'm not putting down Jews, by the way. I'm talking about a specific type of industry, the diamond industry, and the ones in Antwerp. And so the Africans were held back big time, okay? And under the guise of charity. So give them something, they won't need to work for it. Keep them impoverished, feed the right wars, Coney 2012, feed the conflicts, this kind of thing. Keep Africa in chaos. Well, Africa now is a continent in incredible transformation. All over Africa right now, countries that all they ever got from the West was a bowl of soup, a bowl of soup and some vaccines to some needlecraft to sterilize them from Bill Gates, are now having high-speed railways, commuter railways, roads, new suburbs. Western and Asian type high-end modern development is coming to Africa in spades. There are, yes, don't believe me, countries like Tanzania are now in the process of constructing high-speed rail systems, better than anything in Ireland. Countries like Kenya are already there. Gabon, they're already there. Why is this? Because the Russians and the Chinese walk up to these African countries and say, we would like to do some business with you. You have cobalt, we would like cobalt. In return, we'll build you a high-speed railway between your capital city and the airport. And for the first time in Africa's history, the African guys look at each other and go, they actually want to do something for us other than give us anti-AIDS medication and Bob Geldof sandwiches. And suddenly a whole dynamic has now developed in Africa where they're looking towards Russia and China. The whole balance of power is shifting massively in the world right now. This is why the West is doomed. Now, they're not even talking to European governments anymore. They're not even involving themselves with them. They're literally talking with the Chinese and the Russians, and to a smaller extent the Iranians. The Iranians are also heavily involved in developing the petroleum industry in Africa. So while we're building wind farms for Greta, the Africans are building power stations to power their high-speed electric railways. It's changing at a speed that you can't imagine. Lots of the conflicts and inner conflicts that were stoked by the West, Congo being, you saw that movie, the siege of Jatoville, Irish troops in the Congo, for what reason? To fight to protect mining companies and to fight other mining companies. Unbelievable. This is the way the West operated down there. Private armies for, like I know it was the Central America, the American Fruit Company, and those false, banana republics, but they did it all over Africa as well. Now Africa is now doing business dignified without being treated as a charity case by Russia and China. And they like it. They walk out of their capital cities and instead of seeing a Red Cross or Médecins Sans Frontières or some Irish paedophile priest on a sex tourism holiday paid for by the concern or the Trocare box or something from Bob Geldof, they're walking outside and they're seeing Russian engineers with African engineers and working together to build a high-speed rail line. They like what's happening. The Africans, and then one African country does it, and the one next door goes, did you see that new port that they built in the country next door? Who built that? Oh, it's a Chinese Russian business concern with local people. The local, oh God, we need to get a piece of that action. Africa is on the move. It's not on the move because of Western patronizing them. You know, it's not because a new series of Roots is being made in Hollywood. It's not being done because feed the world. It's not being done for that reason. It's not being done help the little black babies. It's being done with dignity, and the Africans are going, thank you. Yes, let's do some more. Let's do some business, man. It's amazing. It's amazing what's going on in Africa. And of course, it's getting no report in the West. The only reason I know about it is I'm interested in railways and transit systems, and that these things show up on Railway Gazette. New high-speed rail system for Tanzania. New light rail in some city in Zambia. Blah blah pops up, and it's all Russian and Chinese technology and trains and stuff like that. And we know how good the Chinese are at building, rail systems. Just look what they did. I think in 20 years they've covered their whole country in high-speed rail systems. And the Russians are not far, but are getting there. They're getting their act together. But they have a different kind of rail system. They have an Indian-style rail system, where it's massive quantities rather than high speed. And so Africa is finally getting a bite of the cherry, and the countries are so what that's doing now is giving countries in Africa confidence. And we now have a situation where Niger says France is not getting our plutonium anymore, and all hell breaks loose. Now, in the past, that would have been met with, let's show these boss some freedom, and, either direct NATO involvement or, a fake revolution would be created to overthrow the government, like in Libya, where they basically pay mercenaries and gangsters to overthrow the government. See, they've learned from Libya as well. Libya was a wake-up call for all of Africa. Here was the Clinton Foundation and Obama taking a successful country. Yeah, it was a dictatorship, okay, but it worked. The Libyan people seemed fairly contented. And they took out Gaddafi, and you had a black American president directly responsible for having slavery reintroduced into the markets in Libya. That's Obama's and Clinton's legacy. They took a functional nation called Libya and they destroyed it. And that was the final line in the sand for the Africans. That was the final line in the sand. And from that point on, they looked around the world and saw that Russia and China were moving, and the African says, we don't have any shit with them. They don't have any shit with us, so let's do some business. And that's what's been happening ever since. Africa is on the move, big time. And it's not because of Bono and Bill Gates and Obama. It's because of Vladimir Putin and the Chinese Communist Party. As hard as that is for some of you to accept, and as weird as that sounds, that's what's happening. Now, what does this result in? Bravery. They're now African nations, starting with Niger, are telling the West to go fuck yourself. And the West can send in their fake army. They can't do another Libya, another freedom. They can't do that because why? There'll be Russian or Chinese troops heavily armed on the ground. They thought that the Russians were backward until they were Ukraine. Now they're in shock that the Russians have weapons systems, their economy is robust, and everything's going fine. They're managing fine with the Russian. It's a war and people are dying, but they're not losing. They're basically just playing with Ukraine. That's not their main interest. Well, everything in the West is Ukraine, Ukraine, Ukraine. I don't know if you've seen that email by Nathaniel Rothschild. Literally screaming at British politicians, we must go to war with direct war with Russia, or the New World Order. The globalists are finished. They are finished. Why? Because they've got Africa. So this may be why they're flooding Europe with Africans, because instead of going down developing Africa properly like the Russians and the Chinese are, they're hoping to bring Africans here and then trained them to go down and attack these Russian countries, these Russian friendly and Chinese friendly African countries. Bay of Pigs, Cuban, American kind of scenario, and I think that's a big part of it. So they're saying, your ancestors came from Niger, didn't they? They're under a dictatorial regime. Why don't you form a Nigerian, a free Nigerian, a free Niger army in Europe and go down and attack them? We'll fund you. The usual the West, it's very difficult for people of us raised in the West, other than I know the tribes and people like us are finding that just how monumentally evil the West actually is. You know, and and a lot of it is rooted in liberalism and Marxism and Bolshevism. Those Russians who say that fascism's roots are really in liberalism, well, that's been proven in spades. Look at all who's pushing for all the hate speech laws and all the restrictions on freedom all over the world. Liberals. No one else. Liberals. Now, Africa, you're going to see a whole different dynamic. In the past, we were going, they're poor Africans. This will be the Irish, right? In the past, they were trained. Sure, the poor Africans, the poor little black babies. Oh, the poor little black babies. We've got to help the Africans, you know. My uncle Seamus is down there. He's a Jesuit priest, and he has a little boy that he lives with called Modangum, you know. And, you know, so now the Irish are neutral about Africa. They haven't heard about it for in a while. So, you know that scene in Father Ted where Ted distracts Dougal with the lighter? He puts it on and Dougal goes to the... That's the Irish people. That's the Irish. That's the average Irish man today. 90% of them, they're like Dougal, following the lighter. 90% of them, plus 99% maybe, and they're a most simple childlike folk, and so they're neutral about Africa right now. Guarantee you, in a few years, they'll be trained to hate Africa and African countries. Because why? Because that'll be the agenda. So the same as got the poor black babies, the poor babies in Africa. Now we're going, the fucking Africans, they're dangerous. They're dangerous people. No, they're dangerous. Now why do they do that? Well, because why will they be told that? They'll be told that because the same reason why Clarence Thomas, the American Supreme Court judge, was on the end of the N-word from American anti-racists and liberals. You see, liberals love people of colour as long as they own them. They love them as long as they own them. As soon as a person of colour starts to think for themselves and run away from their diversity plantation, the liberals, the progressives, the cultural Marxists, the socialists, the Bolsheviks, the Antifa types will immediately call them the N-word. We saw it with Clarence Thomas. They love the coloured people as long as the coloured people are their private property. Like they loved the Africans, they live out all that because they were their pets. But now their pets have gone feral, and are now running with the Russians and the Chinese. So expect lots of hatred of Africa to suddenly appear in the media in the years to come. And lots of stories about how this railway system that they built in one country flopped because the Russians didn't do it properly. And the chances are it probably flopped for some other reason, but they won't tell you about the 50 other ones that worked great. This is how you know how the media works. It's the same reason, you know, and that's how the normies are brainwashed. Not just the evening news, but the magazines on the news stalls. Another one is the best-selling books. Here in Ireland, I think the Irish Times runs the best-selling books. You walk into Eason's, which is the bookshop chain around the country, and the first thing you see are bestsellers. Who's at the top? Fintan O'Toole, a journalist with the Irish Times, or Hillary Clinton. No one's buying them books. They're just put there as bestsellers to make you think you have to buy them, or he or she is important because they're in the bestseller list. No, I can guarantee these people don't sell many books. It's purely a ruse. It's purely... I mean, how could anyone... You read Fintan O'Toole's articles in the Irish Times. This is a guy on a 6-figure salary, the top journalist in Ireland, and he writes like a 12-year-old in school. It's basically he takes a government or corporate press release and just redrafts it, rewrites it. And he's supposed to be this great intellectual. And then he's the best of them. The rest are all Googles, all. And then you have sleazebags like Joe O'Shea, caught drunk driving, who thought the COVID needlecraft would be an opportunity for him to get himself a job in RTE. So he goes on saying, "What we need mandatory needlecraft that these people must be rejected from society." You know, this whole act of the tough journalist. You know, but really he was lobbying for a job in RTE. He thought his opportunity would finally come. Like all of them, they're all like that. But there was a thing this week called the Irish Podcast Festival in Cork. They will have people who have a podcast that 25 people listen to, maybe, and 20 of them are their relatives or friends. But they're nice, safe, pedestrian mainstream. Where someone like me, who these talks in this little phone here, gets an average between 10,000 and 20,000 views, I wouldn't get a look in. Why? Because they know I'd be talking like this. No, so the whole system is run with money, the NGOs, everything. When that all collapses, it all goes down. All goes down. So I'm asking the tribe, Uncle Thomas's study area, start looking into Africa and you will be amazed at the developments down there. And it certainly makes a lot of sense why Niger is now being declared a rogue state. Now, the thing is that the Russians have shown themselves to be remarkably robust. Their economy is fine. They're going by their weapon systems. Now, a lot of it has to do with the education system. The West doesn't have an education system. The Common Core thing from about 11 years, 12 years ago with Bill Gates was the writing on the wall. How do you make 100? 10 plus 10? No, you take 5, add 7, remove 6, add 423, take down 245, then you divide that by 6.95 and you get 100. That was Common Core. What was that about? To destroy the Western brain, to absolutely destroy the Western cognition. And they've lost control. The next video will be about why the West is doomed. But in the meantime, go online and learn about Africa, and don't learn about it from Western news sources. Learn about it from what I do, engineering and other kinds of sources. The world is changing, and the best thing that's ever happened to Africa in its history is happening right now. And what is that? Dignity. Sanguine gnosis. Go Africa.